Thank you everyone for joining us today, especially after possibly tuning in to 8 hours of presentation and discussion with the legislature, followed by additional public testimony this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to have testified to the Senate committee on behalf of the entire Employment Department and give a pretty comprehensive overview of what the agency has done, including how we've responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, our ongoing efforts to address the challenges that so many unemployed Oregonians are facing, and our plans for additional improvements going forward. I also really want to thank the people who shared their personal experiences this morning. We don't take those situations lightly. We know how much those people are suffering, and we're continuing to do everything that we possibly can to address those problems, prioritizing getting payments out to those who have been waiting far too long, and stopping further problems from arising. This conversation that we had with the legislature this week will be continuing during legislative days later in the month of September. And there's also additional conversations going on outside of those formal committee hearings with the legislature. I appreciate the attention that legislators are paying to this and the amount of work and care that they and their staffs have put into helping individuals get their unemployment insurance matters addressed. We certainly understand here how desperate people's situations are, and we know that the legislators do as well, and that's why they've been raising these issues and want to continue the oversight and discussion. I'm confident that with the support of the legislators, we will continue to find more short and long-term ways that we can better serve Oregonians. To give some updates on our application forms and our website, the online Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, or PUA form, is now available in Russian and Vietnamese, along with English and Spanish. Our website, unemployment.oregon.gov, that we continue to add additional information to, is now live and available not just in English and Spanish, but also in Vietnamese, Korean, Simplified Chinese, Russian, Romanian, Khmer, and Arabic. I mentioned during the testimony yesterday in front of the Senate committee that we do have some very rough preliminary estimates for the implementation timeline for three major priorities, each of which has a significant information technology component to it. The first of those is the Lost Wages Assistance Program. That's the new benefit program provided through a FEMA grant that can allow people to receive up to $300 per week in benefits. This takes the place of the prior FPUC program that was providing an additional $600 per week. The new program will provide the additional $300 to most people who are receiving benefits. People do have to certify that they are unemployed or underemployed because of COVID-19 in order to receive these additional FEMA benefits. We do not have an exact date when we will be able to start making these payments. The program is still being built. We're working with our federal and state partners to be able to issue those payments as soon as possible. But based on what we know now, we hope to be able to start issuing those payments by the end of this month. We also don't know how long those payments will last. I shared in the past that there were estimates of 3 to 5 weeks. We have been seeking weekly benefit amounts as soon as they're available. So far, we have been able to submit applications for and receive funds that would cover 5 weeks worth of benefits. So the time period of July 26th through August 29th. We'll be able to continue to draw benefits on a weekly basis until the program ends. We don't know when that will be because it depends on when the federal money is exhausted. After the Lost Wages Assistance Program, we'll be focusing on getting people payments for the waiting week. This is something that's been talked about quite a bit. We have done some work and preliminary planning so that we can get this done as quickly as possible. It will still be a very major effort. We'll be issuing payments to people who did not receive the waiting week since the start of the pandemic. For people who had the waiting week fall between March 29th and July 25th, they will also receive the additional $600 from that FPUC program. The federal law does not allow us to provide the additional payment for people whose waiting weeks were outside of that time period. Our goal is to start making those waiting week payments by late November. And the third priority is the work to implement Senate Bill 1701, passed recently during the second special session of the Oregon legislature. That bill increases how much many people can earn each week before it starts to reduce their weekly benefits. It increases that amount to $300. And our goal is to start making retroactive payments to the date that bill first becomes effective, and to start making those payments by mid-December. And I do want to emphasize that these are very preliminary estimates. As we get into doing the work, we may discover that we're able to move it along a little bit quicker, or we may discover complications that mean it will take longer. There also may be unexpected system needs that our team has to divert to address. And if there are additional programs that are created, that could change the timeline as well. One other change going on is some rulemaking. Early on in the pandemic, the Employment Department promulgated temporary rules that changed the normally applicable standards for people to receive unemployment insurance to match the very unusual circumstances that we're facing in this pandemic. Temporary rules by law are only allowed to be in effect for 180 days, and we're nearing the end of that time period. We are doing permanent rulemaking to permit the Employment Department to more readily adjust those eligibility requirements during declared emergencies. Although that permanent rulemaking will not be done prior to the expiration of the temporary rule, it will be retroactive, and we do not anticipate there being any changes to the standards that are currently in place. So, for example, people will still be considered to be actively seeking work as long as they are willing to look for work as soon as the emergency declarations are no longer in effect. As the pandemic continues to run its course and as the economy begins to reopen, we will continue to re-examine these standards and they will change in the future, but we do not see any imminent change even with the expiration of the temporary rule. In terms of the initial processing of claims, we continue to do that very quickly. Between March 15th and August 29th, we have received 556,600 claims for regular unemployment insurance benefits. That compares to the 66,100 received during that same time period last year. And we continue to have just a relatively small number of claims that have not yet been processed, just over 1,000. Most of those are just a few days old. Even the most complicated are just 2 weeks old. So that initial processing is going quickly. We continue to work on the pain points of adjudication and some other issues that are addressing regular and PUA claims. For the PUA claims, we have now paid $143 million to just under 49,000 people receiving PUA benefits. The WorkShare program continues to be used very widely. We have about 1,570 employers covering just under 65,000 workers receiving WorkShare benefits. The total amount of benefits the department has paid between March 15th and August 29th is $4.1 billion, continuing the trend of us having paid out years worth of benefits since this pandemic began. We continue to increase our staffing and have made significant progress. We now have 331 adjudicators, slightly more than our original target. And that's going to allow us to pick up the pace and continue to address those adjudication issues more and more quickly. I am sad to report that we had another colleague who tested positive for COVID-19. We've notified the employees who work in that location, and we've reached out to the county health officials. We also continue to add more and more workplace safety measures in our offices to keep our employees as safe as possible. And I do want to commend our employees for their continued commitment to keeping themselves and each other safe in the workplace during this nationwide pandemic. And they're doing that while they face coming in every day to a daunting amount of work and helping people that are in dire situations. One of our commitments is to make sure that those dedicated employees have what they need, not just in terms of the equipment and technology to do their jobs, but also in terms of support and guidance, and especially as they are learning all these new programs and rules and systems, that we provide additional training so that they are even more able to help people. One of the ways that we're doing that is by continuing our telework pilot. We have more than 20 adjudicators that are part of that telework pilot. We also have been able to add 16 people that do other types of work that previously couldn't be done by teleworking into the pilot. So we have almost 40 people teleworking now that were previously not able to, and it has been a very successful pilot. These pilot teleworkers are in addition to the more than 200 other employees approximately that have been teleworking since early on in the pandemic. For those that are part of this pilot project, they've been very adaptable, and they've allowed us to identify several issues that did cause problems, and our team has worked through most of those issues. There are still some that we have to continue to work on, but we think that we've handled enough of them that we are now rolling out additional small groups of adjudicators to add them to that pilot project. And we're doing that as quickly as our already overworked information technology team is able to support that transition to having those people work at home. The testimony this morning, for those of you that listened to it, really highlighted the horrible desperation that many people are experiencing. We see that every day here while we're doing our work, and that's why we are pushing to ease that pain absolutely as quickly as we can. We know that hearing that they just need to wait isn't cutting it. It doesn't help people pay their bills or their rent, help them buy groceries, or ease the fear and pain that they're suffering. I want to make it very clear that the Employment Department hasn't lost sight of our guiding vision. We're unwavering in our commitment to serving the needs of Oregonians, and we will keep pivoting, adjusting, and innovating as long as this painful moment requires it of us. When I testified, I shared two themes, and I want to highlight those now. One is that very serious suffering and anxiousness that so many are under, and that's very painful, and for each person, it can be just devastating. Those people are waiting to get their benefits while they're dealing with all the other stressors in their life, including those around working through the pandemic. At the same time, the other theme is that the employees at the Employment Department have done historic amounts of work. In 5 months, they have done more work than in the previous 7.5 years, scaling up amazingly quickly. And despite that heroic work, it still isn't enough to meet the demand. We're making a lot of progress, but we certainly know that we're not there yet. And for each person who hasn't yet received all their benefits, knowing that we're making progress doesn't help until they've received the benefits that they individually need. Until that happens, their situation, that of their family, isn't better. And we know that. That's why we are prioritizing getting benefits out to the people who've been waiting the longest, and why we're not going to slow down until we've gotten everybody all of the benefits that they're entitled to, and that we are continuing to do that on an ongoing and quick basis. Thank you all, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, David. In just a moment, I'm going to unmute everybody. So if you can please just mute yourself if you've got background noise, and I will be calling on folks to ask questions in the order that you RSVP'd. So first, let's start with Lindsay Nadrich with COIN.
Hi, David. Thanks for doing this again. I did listen in to the testimony this morning, and it is hard to hear. A senator called it heartbreaking as well. I mean, one woman said her car's been repossessed. Another guy's racking up credit card debt. Another representative called it the single biggest failure of the state. I mean, what's your reaction to that and some of the feedback from this testimony?
I agree that the circumstances that individuals are facing it is heartbreaking, and that's what everybody at the Employment Department, we're hearing these stories constantly every day, and that's why people are so committed to working incredibly long hours on weekends, on holidays, doing everything that we can to get those benefits out. It is a horrible situation, and we absolutely recognize that. In terms of it being a disaster, absolutely, the unemployment insurance system hasn't been able to meet the needs. That's the case not just in Oregon, but in every state in the nation. And we are living through a huge disaster, and the pandemic has had an enormous hit on unemployed workers and certainly on the unemployment insurance systems that try to support them. It's also impacted all types of other parts of our society, healthcare, schools. For the unemployment insurance system, no state's unemployment insurance program has been able to deal with this, and it is a huge disaster, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I do disagree that it's a disaster caused by the Employment Department, if that is how it was being read or interpreted. The disaster is the pandemic, and going almost overnight from record low unemployment to record high, and just that incredible need that was thrust upon all the unemployment insurance programs nationwide overnight. And I think it's true that absolutely that it is a disaster, and it's a disaster that our employees are doing everything they can to mitigate and to address. And so far, the amazing work that they've been able to do still hasn't been enough.
And if I could just push back on that a little bit, the people constantly are bringing up, the money we got a decade ago to upgrade the computer system, and that's the reason it's such a disaster.
And certainly there are parts of what we're dealing with in Oregon that having a modernized system would have eased. And that's one of the reasons that we are committed. And one of the things that we asked for legislative support on was to continue the momentum that we have with replacing the current technology with a modernized system. But even the states that have modernized systems have suffered the same kinds of problems that Oregon has. When you look around the nation, states that had old technology like Oregon does, because Oregon is not the only state that hasn't modernized its systems for unemployment insurance. So other states that are in that situation and ones that have brand new technology all have been unable to keep up with the demand. So certainly it would have been easier for us to deal with some of the challenges, but even if our modernization had been done years ago, this still would have been a challenge, and there still would be too many Oregonians suffering a lot of pain in this disaster.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Up next, we have Bill Poehler with the Statesman Journal.
Hey, David. So after hearing the stories today, it got me to thinking: is there any way that you guys can? And obviously, those are people who are on the list and they're somewhere in the queue. But is there some way to triage the worst of those cases who are still outstanding and still trying to get benefits?
Sure, and that's something that we've been trying to do all along. With the initial onslaught of the pandemic, it was just this flood of work, and we've been trying to focus on people who have been waiting the longest, who are in the most desperate situation. I think like when you're in any triage situation, by definition, you're not able to get to everyone as quickly as you need to. We had some additional challenges, for instance, with the brand new PUA program, where when we first stood that up so that we could start getting at least some benefits out, we didn't have a way to be able to sort the claims in a way that let us focus on the oldest claims first. We have built a number of tools to let us do that internally as we review the work and how we pull that up for the next claim to be worked on, and also with the Contact Us forum that has been the first communication tool that has really let us focus on who has been waiting the longest to receive the benefits and try to get those handled first. There is an added complication that sometimes when we're focusing on the people that have been waiting the longest, some of those issues we're able to resolve very quickly. Some of them, for instance, if it's something that requires adjudication or additional information from another state, that can still take some time even after we're working on it. But we are absolutely working on making sure that we're identifying those who have been waiting the longest, and that there are ways for people to tell us if they're in that category so that we can identify them if for some reason it wasn't already being worked on.
That's good. So you mentioned that, or well, I guess one of the areas that they were kind of hoping for to have some clarity on was if there are ways that the legislature can help the employment department. Do you see anything coming out of these 3 days of hearings that help that you guys that you expect to have from the state now?
Well, I think we'll be having some ongoing discussions. There are several things that we identified that we asked for some assistance with. Even though most of the funding for running the unemployment insurance system is federal funds that we're getting, and we're certainly getting more now under the CARES Act and because of the vastly increased workload, even when we get the additional funding, it does require legislative approval for us to spend that money and to get additional position authority. And that's something that we've already asked for during this pandemic and received. And we're going to be asking for that again, both in the short term and in longer term planning, because the workload for us and the unemployment pains for Oregonians is going to continue. There's also some other opportunities. The Lost Wages Assistance Program requires some additional state funds. And that's something that the state as an entity will need to have a source to pay to FEMA. And we're seeking flexibility from the legislature to be able to use a fraud control fund that currently has some very limited uses. And that will allow us to administer the Lost Wages Assistance Program and get those extra benefits out to people. in terms of a legislative solution that would let us, get the benefits out to people that are waiting within a week or something, and kind of quickly fix all of the issues for people who are waiting, there really aren't any legislative solutions that would let that happen. We haven't heard of any. We've heard a lot of suggestions from legislators and others, and we've certainly tried many of those. We've come up with many, and we've tried a lot. There isn't a silver bullet that would let us quickly address all of those issues, unfortunately.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Bill. Next, we have Dick Hughes with the Hughesisms.
Hi, thank you very much. Following up on Bill Paler's question from the hearings this week, and especially today, are there things you will do differently because of the hearings?
Well, I'm hesitating because we're pretty much constantly evaluating what we're going to change. We have daily meetings where we are making changes, sometimes very minor ones because what we're focused on is going pretty smoothly as well as we can see it going. Other times we're making pretty significant shifts. I think there's certainly some longer term planning information that we need to share more of with the legislature, talking about as the economy starts to reopen and making sure that the public is more aware of these potential benefit cliffs when these programs will run out. I think it will take some more discussions to know if there are other concrete things that will immediately change operations, but we are pretty much every day, if something comes up that we think would be helpful, we're making changes to implement that.
Dick, did you have a follow-up question?
No, I'm sorry, I accidentally muted myself when I was saying thank you. No follow-up question.
Okay, thanks. Next, we've got Tom Cusack with Oregon Housing Blog. Is Tom on the line? We can come back and check at the end. Next is Mike Rogaway with the Oregonian.
Hey, David. As we went over the last few days, there's been a lot of change over the last 6 months, and some of the biggest pain points have been addressed. I wonder, one thing we didn't hear a lot about was the phone system, and I wonder if there's been a thought about redoing that. You said early in your tenure that the volume of calls was just too much to implement a callback system or some more structured thing. This is a thing that I probably hear most from people, is how frustrating it is to try and get through. Are we at a point now where we could change our approach as a state and do something more structured like the DMV did?
We are looking at that actively. We're having, there were some email discussions that we've been having over the past several days about looking at how that would be implemented, how it would play out, all of those matters. I think we're at a time where we can have that look at it. We don't yet know if it would be helpful. What we don't want to do, I think when I have talked about it before, if we had turned on a virtual callback or some kind of appointment system early on in the pandemic, after the first day when we were receiving, tens of thousands of applications, we already would have been scheduling callbacks or meetings several weeks or even months out. And some other states actually saw that, where they tried to do appointments and they were scheduling an appointment months out, and they were still getting more appointments coming in each day than they were able to hold. So it really wasn't helping anyone. People were being told, we'll be able to talk to you in several months about your claim, and those people still needed help right away and were still calling to try to get assistance. Our call volume has gone down. That being said, the number of calls coming in, I shared at one point in the past that we had 20 million call attempts in a month. It's down to about a quarter of that, about 5 million. So that's down. It's still very significant. So we need to look carefully to see if doing that callback or the appointment system is something that would work and actually provide better customer service now. And then depending on what type of effort and time is needed to implement that, we want to make sure that it wouldn't detract from our ability to get the new benefit programs stood up, to get the waiting week paid out and those things. But we are exploring it now because we certainly think we're at a time where it makes sense to be ready to do that as soon as we can.
Okay, that's all I had today. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Next is Keaton Thomas with K2.
Hey, David, thanks for taking the time. First is I wanted to ask you about the waiting week. I mean, it kind of was one of the newsier aspects of the hearings was actually having a date. Can you tell me, first of all, do you have any sort of estimate on the number of people who would be owed that waiting week? And can you tell me how, you touched on it earlier, but how accurate is that end of November? Like if you could put a percentage on it, how accurate is that end of November timeline?
So I don't have the data in front of me about how many people that will impact. We have looked at it to try to estimate the number of people and how many of those would also be able to get the extra $600. I'm sorry, I just don't have that handy right now. In terms of confidence level in the date, not very, to be frank. We are doing our best to be transparent and want to be very clear that this is not a set in stone date. We don't want people to absolutely rely on it, but we are really committed to sharing the information that we have. Our IT professionals have been able to do little bits of looking at the system in between all the other projects that they're doing, not enough to get significant amounts of work done, but enough to do some planning and to really come up with an approach that will let the work be done more quickly. So we both, earlier when asked, I was saying I couldn't commit to us getting it done by the end of the year. We've both been able to shift from kind of an end of the year to an end of November kind of time frame. And we are more confident now than we were before, but there's still a lot of room for uncertainty, especially if there's congressional action that requires us to change programs or implement a new program.
Then the other question that I had is after these 3 days worth of hearings and after what's been several months of you guys, working day in and day out, do you think, how do I word this? Do you think that moving forward, the department should do a complete overhaul of the way it operates and pays out unemployment benefits that would be different from what it is now?
I'll give kind of a two-part answer. In some ways, we can't because a lot of the core structural pieces are required by federal law. So for instance, the fact that we have to adjudicate certain issues, the fact that we have to check for some programs to see if people are eligible for other programs or benefits in other states, how we have to connect with other states and federal computer systems. A lot of those processes, and sometimes to quite a bit of detail, are set out as mandatory requirements for states. So those things, we can certainly have discussions and urge change at the federal level, but we can't on our own change that. We absolutely do want to change a lot of the ways that we do the processes, though, within those federal parameters. And that's actually a lot of what our modernization program has been focused on. I think a lot of the discussion has been about it as an IT project, and it certainly is a very large IT project. But that IT component is really secondary. It's there to support the change of the work that we do. And we do think that when it's done, one of the big advantages that it has is that it changes a lot of how we do our work and what that process is. Probably the most visible example to the public, and it's something I think I may have hit on during the legislative testimony. Right now, a lot of our employees have to learn the laws, learn our systems, and do a lot of individual follow-up with people to get clarification, to get extra information after the claim or the weekly claim has been filed. A lot of the modernized systems, and it's certainly a requirement for us in any system that we would consider, is that a lot of the data entry and the manual work that our employees currently have to do will be automated so that they're really exercising their skills, their experience, and their talents on the things that require that, and they're able to focus their time on that. And they get a lot more information in a much more focused way from people as they seek benefits that can really significantly speed up the process. So modernization is an IT project. It's also really a transformation of how we serve the public. And I think if you look at our main goals in modernization, it really is focused on that customer experience, including how easy it is to use, how easy it is to communicate with us and understand what's going on. And a key to that is how quickly we're able to process the claims and get benefits to people.
Thanks.
Thanks, Keaton. Next is Rob Manning with OPB. Is Rob on the line? I will come back to Rob at the end. Is Peter Wong with the Portland Tribune on?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Some of this has been touched on already, but David, is there any talk? I know most state agencies such as yours are more focused on taking care of the immediate problems, but it seems like I've covered some of this stuff in the previous recession, and some of the same problems keep cropping up, and I realize this system really hasn't really been overhauled almost since the beginning. And you've consistently mentioned the adding of the PUA, for example, is something that hadn't been done prior to now. I mean, that's been almost 75 years since the unemployment current system's been created. Has been any talk among the state agencies that handle this stuff? I realize this is really more of Congress's prerogative, but this is almost like health insurance. Nobody can explain it. In fact, you heard the comment from the person who said he has a doctorate in public policy and he can hardly follow the unemployment system. Now, I'm not saying it's as complicated as a health insurance system, but there's something to be said for that comment.
Sure, and I think one of the other people who testified also said that it seemed to her like the crux of the problem was that the system itself is really convoluted, and it is in many ways convoluted. So we certainly do have those discussions. I think our state agency and every other state agency is still focused on the urgent crises, getting people their benefits, trying to implement these new programs. We are having discussions about the long-term changes that we think are needed. And some of these are things that were advocated for after the Great Recession. A couple of the key ones, one is around the adequate funding. When we're in a crisis like this, the federal funding to run the programs tends to be sufficient, and there's a lot of attention paid to these programs. And then when the economy starts to recover and unemployment insurance impacts fewer people, it's not as vital to the overall economy, although it's still very vital to each individual person that relies on it. The funding levels go down very significantly, and states have suffered from year after year of inadequate federal funding to administer the programs. And what that means is when the crisis hits, you're coming at it underfunded. So the fact that you then get money to deal with it really isn't that much help. It's somebody giving you a smoke alarm after the house is already on fire. So we think that sustainable, sufficient administrative funding is one of the key elements that's needed. Another thing that has been advocated for, and Oregon and other states have worked together through the National Association of State Workforce Agencies to do this, is to have a more consistent structure to scale up benefits when there is a large recession. So you said that a lot of the things we're seeing now are very similar to what we saw during the Great Recession, where we're seeing new programs created to provide additional weeks of benefits, to provide some additional dollars of benefits, things like that. Each time those are enacted by Congress, they're slightly different. And that creates a lot of complexity. It makes it more difficult for states to plan. We have been advocating for a long-term approach where there are some pre-formed benefit extensions and additions that can be triggered on when we're in particularly bad economic situations, but where every state could know ahead of time what it is that they'll have to implement, instead of having to wait until after the law is enacted to really start to then figure out, how do we program our computers? How do we start to talk to the people that need these benefits? So we think that those are just two key examples, but that those would go a long way towards making all state systems a lot more resilient in the face of recessions.
Okay, thanks. No follow-up other than to say that hopefully I'm not going to be around for the next Great Recession, but I think it's incumbent on us now to ask the questions and try to get the solutions that we didn't do in the last round of the last economic downturn. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Next, we have Devin Haskins with KGW. Devin, are you on the line? I see Devin in here, but we can't hear you. You can chat your question in if you're having technical difficulties.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I had headphones on. I was trying to figure out where the microphone was or why it wasn't working. I just had kind of more of a follow-up question to what Keaton had asked about the waiting week. Is it looking like you're not going to be able to make those payments by the end of the year? You said you're not very confident on the date. And is there a chance that it'll extend into 2021, as I had previously heard?
So our current best estimate is end of November, but I'm not very confident of that estimate. So there's still a lot of room for things to change, but currently we're thinking end of November for us to start making those waiting week payments. It is possible that it would extend into next year, and we're continuing to work with the U.S. Department of Labor to see if we can get assurances that the additional $600 would still be available to people if that happens.
All right, thank you. That's pretty much it. Sorry it took me so long to get to you.